Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so we are covering Spider-Man, but here's something that I want to throw out there real quick, right? Because I know some people are going to ask the question, Rob, didn't you cover this already? What I covered was Spider-Man 2. Here's the important thing about this, right? Spider-Man is probably one of the most important Spider-Man stories, I'd say, of the last 15 years. And the reason why is because this is the story where Peter Parker first met Miles Morales, right? So, one of the things that we've talked about here over the course of really some of the Miles Morales videos that we've done and a lot of the Peter Parker videos that we did is we kind of talked about the nature of the Ultimate Universe, right? So if you guys are familiar with this, we just finished a video yesterday where we talked about that in the Miles Morales one, right? So just kind of bear with me, right? We'll probably have some new people to the channel. I know you guys kind of like to get directly into it, but bear with me for a second while I kind of reiterate this. For the people who are new here, right? Who are new to Marvel Comics. In Marvel, you have a great big huge multiverse, right? Technically, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is considered part of the multiverse that makes up all of Marvel Comics. We know that for a couple different reasons. One, because it actually has a numerical designation among the Marvel multiverse, and two, because there's comics based on it, right? So that kind of brings it closer in line with being part of the Marvel multiverse. But where you had Marvel Comics as it was originally launched in the 1960s, right, with the Fantastic Four #1 and so on and so forth, that's referred to as Earth 616, right? Also known as the main Marvel universe. What we got in the year 2000 was the creation of the Ultimate Universe. And this was an answer to the question, what would it look like if at that point in time in the year 2000, superheroes had just basically popped up, right? They just kind of emerged for the very first time. What would those superheroes look like? How would they function? How would all that stuff work? And that's basically where you got Peter Parker in the Ultimate Universe. Now, Ultimate Spider-Man was exceedingly popular, right? It was hugely popular because in a lot of ways, it was kind of an indirect reboot, right? Marvel didn't really reboot everything with the main Marvel Universe Spider-Man. They just gave us a new one and people loved it, right? People absolutely loved it. But what you saw was a story where basically Peter Parker died, right? Peter Parker Spider-Man was killed, and it might behoove us to go back and cover that event, right? Cover Cataclysm and the death of Peter Parker, right? It might behoove us to do that just because, we're kind of doing a lot of this stuff because the new Spider-Man game's coming out for the PlayStation. But the idea is that when that version of Peter Parker died, we ended up getting Miles Morales in his place. And when Miles Morales first showed up, there was a lot of naysayers. There were a lot of people who were just kind of like, Miles Morales sucks. He's not really Spider-Man. He's not really Peter Parker, that kind of a thing, because it kind of came from a couple different places. A lot of fans were latched on to the idea of Peter Parker, even when they were reading him before the Ultimate Universe was launched, right? So all they really got was just another alternate reality version of Peter, and they loved it. A lot of people grew attached to Peter Parker Spider-Man in the Ultimate Universe when that was their first place to start in Marvel Comics. But by whatever manner and whatever means, a lot of people just didn't want to see things change. This story is, in a lot of ways, kind of Brian Michael Bendis snubbing people who were naysayers of Miles Morales, right? People who were just like, this character's not going to last or anything like that. It was kind of Bendis just being like, no, he will. Like, he's going to be around for a long time. And that's really where this comes from. And I tell you that because it's important that you understand the historical context of this story as we get into it, so you can understand why this story is considered to be so important. With all that out of the way, let us jump to the main story itself. And so what we end up getting here is picking up in the main Marvel universe, Earth 616, with Peter Parker Spider-Man. And it's Peter Parker just kind of doing the stuff that Peter Parker does, right? Like swinging around, coming across some criminals, some guys who are doing some things they're not supposed to do. But here's the funny thing about this. Because of the fact that this story was written as a way to kind of tie into or kind of bring together the Ultimate Universe and the main Marvel Universe, this story was written in such a way to where it was designed to treat people as if they're aware of who Spider-Man is, but they don't really know much about him, right? They don't really know a whole lot about the character, right? So it's kind of reiterating the nature of Peter Parker. And that's one of the things that you see in Marvel Comics. There are certain characters out there who people know who they are, right? People know who Iron Man is now. People know who Spider-Man is. People know who Wolverine is. But knowing who the character is and understanding the history and the context of the character are two distinctly different things. So a lot of people know who Iron Man is, but I doubt they really know anything about the Mandarin, or I doubt they know about stories like Demon in a Bottle and why it's so important. What is it? The Five Nightmares run by Matt Fraction, different things like that, right? Arno Stark, Kieran Gillen's run. A lot of people probably aren't really familiar with that. So the idea is that we're just kind of giving Peter Parker in terms of how Peter Parker operates, which is to say, kind of musing to himself about how much he loves New York City and the fact that New York City is kind of like a thinking, breathing entity, right? That there are so many facets to this city. You've got people who have their nose to the ground and they're just grinding day in and day out, just trying to make it by. You've got people who are just super high up in their ivory towers, you know, the Tony Starks, the Reed Richards, who don't really have to worry about small time things, right? But you kind of have everybody who falls in between, and there's just so many different varying types of people in the city of New York that is just so unique in that way. What it also has are criminals. There's criminals in New York City, and Spider-Man goes to visit some, and he basically wallops them one or two times, shows them what for, and then of course, you know, ends up pulling over the vehicle, you know, which was their getaway car. And as soon as he's there, he's met by the arrival of the cops, right? And the cops are just like, take off your mask, show us your face, you know, that kind of a thing. Now, the truth about this is I was never really part and parcel to this kind of depiction of Spider-Man, of Peter Parker. And the reason why is because you have had stories over the years where J. Jonah Jameson and the Daily Bugle have kind of managed to sort of turn, you know, the idea of Spider-Man into something where he can't really be trusted, he's a menace. But the long and short of it is that over the years, Spider-Man was largely trusted by society, right? You know, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. He was the good guy, right? He was largely trusted in that way. There have been times where it's waxed and waned, but in this instance, I kind of feel like it should have been one of those things where it's like, thanks, Spider-Man, you know, and then that's kind of it, right? Now, the fact that the cops show up here and he's behind the wheel of a getaway car might give him a little reason to be sus, right? But I don't know why I say that all the time. Mariah started saying sus and now I say it all the time, right? Like sus. It's a weird word. But anyway, once he takes off and he kind of, you know, goes and does his thing, he ends up finding this building, you know, this kind of this office building basically, where the roof has been shattered, right? The glass has been shattered, and he's kind of like, that's a little weird. Now, of course, he ends up being drawn to that location because of a giant bright light, almost kind of an explosion of sorts. And of course, once he gets there, like the whole place kind of seems to be tarnished, right? And there's just this white light, or this bright light emanating from it all. Now, as he gets in there and as he starts investigating, his initial thought is this energy source is a little weird. Now, this story was released about a year after Spider-Man Big Time. And for those of you guys who aren't really familiar, if you ever wanted to get into Spider-Man, I always suggest people start with Big Time. We have that whole series covered on my channel. And Big Time was the start of Dan Slott's run. You had Spider-Man and you had Mary Jane, who were like married and all that kind of stuff. And then you got One More Day, then you got Brand New Day, where Marvel basically nullified it all. Because that was just so poorly received, Big Time was kind of Marvel's huge shift with Peter Parker, right? Focusing on like an all new age for Peter Parker Spider-Man. But that's kind of the good place to start, right? Because Dan Slott's run begins with that and runs all the way up through Secret Wars and after Secret Wars into Clone Conspiracy, right? So it's like a 10, almost 15 year long run of Spider-Man. It's very, very lengthy, but I think it's also incredibly good. I think it's an amazing run on Spider-Man. But the whole idea behind this is that that this takes place about a year after that. Now, the reason why I mention that is because I'm not entirely partial to how this is handled by Bendis, right? Bendis is notorious for writing a character and then pretending like nothing anybody did ever happened, right? And it's just like, the only things that matter with this character is what I'm doing here, and ignoring continuity in its entirety. Now, whether it's kind of Bendis is always that way, I'm not 100% sure. I wasn't really reading Bendis back when he was part of event publications with Jimmy Palmiotti and Joe Quesada. I wasn't really reading him back then. I only really got familiar with Brian Michael Bendis once he actually came into main Marvel itself and was writing like New Avengers, right? And New Avengers was a wholly new thing, so he could kind of get away with that. It's something that I think maybe a result of his huge amount of popularity, and it's kind of like, I'm Bendis, I can do whatever in the heck I want. I don't know if that's really the case or not, but the reason why that matters is because during Spider-Man Big Time, Peter Parker's intelligence had always kind of been downplayed by Marvel Comics, right? They never really kind of elevated Peter Parker to being on par with like Reed Richards or Tony Stark. You always kind of knew he was, but they never really did any of that for him. Instead, what you end up getting here is Peter Parker kind of looking at this and just being like, man, this is weird. He's like, it's not, you know, anything alien in nature. Maybe I should get a hold of like Tony Stark or Reed Richards or something like that. During Big Time, one of the big things that Dan Slott did was focus on the intelligence of Peter Parker, and in being like, Peter Parker's actually pretty daggone smart, and he doesn't always need Reed Richards or Tony Stark to solve a problem on his own. That was kind of solidified in a story where there was like a bomb that was going to go off and nobody else could defuse it, and Peter Parker was the one who did, right? So it was kind of elevating his intelligence up and basically telling the reader base, hey, Peter Parker's not as dumb as he's being made out to be. You know, he's not just a Spider-Man, right? He's a super intelligent guy. Let's start treating him that way. So I'm not entirely partial on how this works, but as he starts navigating this room, he starts to realize all this stuff belongs to Mysterio, right? All these things belong to him. And that's when Mysterio tries to sneak up behind Peter and attack him. And of course, Peter Parker's spider sense goes off, and he basically ends up, you know, kind of being aware that he's about to be attacked and manages to dodge out of the way. Now with Mysterio, and one thing that a lot of you guys are probably aware of after having seen Spider-Man Far From Home, Mysterio is a legitimate, credible threat to Peter Parker, right? He's probably one of Peter Parker's most dangerous villains. His ability to cast illusions to basically trick Peter Parker and his spider sense, it can be pretty difficult to overcome Mysterio. And that's one of the reasons why you have, you know, Peter Parker kind of saying here, like, I've got to get this guy down as fast as I can because this guy is a real and serious threat. The other part of this is that Mysterio keeps rambling on about how like Peter Parker's ruining things and he's kind of destroying things and so on and so forth. And then he goes as far as to say, like, you have no idea what you're dealing with, right? You have no idea what I'm capable of. I missed out when you died the first time. I'm not going to miss out this time, right? So right off the bat, our cue is that this is some kind of ability from Mysterio to actually look through into the Ultimate Universe where that version of Peter Parker died. And Mysterio wants to be in that universe where Peter Parker doesn't exist, right? His main nemesis, the person that always foiled his plans, he's just trying to find a way to escape. And so what you end up getting here is Peter just kind of looking at this and saying like, what is this thing, right? Is this some kind of a power generator or whatever this is? It's weird that this is here, but like I can call people that can basically break this down and take this thing apart so we don't really have to worry about it, right? While Peter Parker doesn't really know what's going on with this device, he knows enough about Mysterio to know it's probably not a good thing, right? Like when supervillains start doing weird things that you don't understand, you can usually just assume it's bad, and you're not usually wrong in doing that. It's a good rule of thumb to have. But of course, in his desperation, Mysterio ends up grabbing a handgun and firing it off and then missing Peter Parker and hitting his device. And when that happens, he's yanked through, right? Peter is seemingly yanked through into basically the Ultimate Universe. And this is the first time, one of the reasons why this is so big, this is the very, very first time in the history of Marvel Comics that a character from the main Marvel Universe crossed over into the Ultimate Universe, right? This was a huge deal. Now, the Ultimate Universe, it exists now in Marvel Comics, but it's nowhere near as a big deal as it was back in like the early to mid 2000s, right? At around the time, and even really in the early 2010s when this story was written, this is when the Ultimate Universe was really kind of at its prime, depending on, what you were reading. There was a lot of fall off after the death of Peter Parker. We can't really, that's just an absolute thing. We can't really argue that point. But the death of Peter Parker in the Ultimate Universe actually made headlines, right? It made national news headlines. And so because of that, there was a lot of interest in the Ultimate Universe. And so it was really a great time to capitalize on that, right? To kind of give us this story. But this is a big deal when this first happened. And so as Peter Parker's there, he's like, okay, this is weird. Like it's suddenly daytime. I don't know what that great big huge building is over there. That's the Triskelion, that great big huge tower looking thing off in the water. You guys probably recognize the Triskelion from Captain America, the Winter Soldier. That's where this comes from. That's why we say the Marvel Cinematic Universe is a combination of the Ultimate Universe, the main Marvel Universe, and Earth 98, where the heroes age in real time. It's kind of a combination of those three things. But he ends up traveling back to the building where you had, the whole, Mysterio's base of operations and everything popping off. And he basically ends up breaking into the place only to find out that it's occupied with some girl in a towel. And he's like, my bad. And basically bails out, right? Ends up taking off. From there, he actually ends up rescuing a guy who's, kind of being beat up a little bit. He takes out the two people who were beating this dude up, and he basically says he was just playing pool, and then suddenly they jumped him. But the fact that he's wearing a Peter Parker costume, wearing a Spider-Man costume, does not go unnoticed by this guy. And he's like, look, I appreciate you saving me, but like, it's really in bad taste for you to wear that costume right now. What's more so than that, he's like, we all need heroes, but that was Peter Parker's costume. And that's one of the big things to know. When Peter Parker died, and even Peter Parker as Spider-Man, his identity was known, right? When all that popped off, his identity was known to the world. People were like, the world needs to know that this is the kid who tried to save everybody, who died a hero. That's why the death of Peter Parker was so massive in the Ultimate Universe, right? Like, imagine, for example, that like in the main Marvel Universe in Marvel Comics, that Iron Man dies, and it's this great big huge event that crosses over every single comic that they have, right? It's like the death of Iron Man, the Incredible Hulk tie-in and the Captain America tie-in and all that kind of stuff, right? Like everything ties into just the fact that Iron Man died and how everybody's coping with it. That's what the death of Peter Parker was. It was just huge. It was massive because Spider-Man had never actually been killed off in Marvel Comics with no intention of bringing him back, right? That's just never happened before, right? I mean, Marvel kind of tried it with the Clone Saga, but like, nah, it was never gonna happen. With the Ultimate Universe, it's the way it is. Peter Parker's been dead. He's like the Peter Parker Spider-Man concept is dead, and Miles Morales had taken it over and has been that way ever since. So it was kind of a big deal. It was a huge deal when it happened. But this guy, the fact that this guy reveals that they know who Peter Parker is really throws like the main Marvel Universe Peter Parker off, because his identity is something that he keeps insanely close guarded. Right now, in Civil War, he revealed it to the world just as kind of a proof of the fact that he trusted Iron Man's superhero registration. But of course, as we saw in the aftermath of that Brand New Day, that Doctor Strange came along and just magicked everybody's memory of Peter Parker's identity out of their heads. Right? He's just like, you magic. and then nobody remembered that Peter Parker was Spider-Man, and that was essentially it, right? That was basically it. That's probably what they're going to end up doing in Spider-Man 3, the movie. But the whole point behind this is that this throws Peter Parker for a loop, because he's kind of like, okay, that's crazy. Like, wherever it is, they're referring to me in the third person. So one, this guy doesn't know who I am, but he knows who Peter Parker is. So that means there was a Peter Parker here in this place. What in the world is going on right now? And so what ends up happening is he's ultimately met by the arrival of Miles Morales. And Miles Morales pops up and he's just like, no way, right? Because to the eyes of Miles Morales, this is the ultimate universe version of Peter Parker. It's like Peter Parker has come back. That's what kind of blew things off, right? That's what makes Miles Morales kind of go nuts here. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.